Okay. All right. So this is our last class before you kind of finish up, hand in your last assignment and take your final on Monday. Any questions before we get in to the course material tonight? I will just remind you that you have your last apply your knowledge question due this weekend. So just make sure you get that in on time, because once the final is taken on Monday, that's it. I'll go ahead and Tuesday morning start initiating the process for submitting grades. So it's really important that you get that in. I know things happen, but you know, anything you can do. If you run into problems, let me know right away, but you need to get that in. And then I'll send out additional reminders about not only that assignment, but the final on Monday as well. So you can take that. The final is going to be the same format. I was going to add some additional short answers, but I'm going to, because you've done enough writing throughout the semester, I'm going to go ahead and put that aside and let your other assignments speak for themselves as far as your writing, your comprehension, and those kind of things. So by tomorrow afternoon, my goal is to have your civil liberties political cartoon finished. You'll be done grading. I'll be done grading those. Your online discussion assignment will be done as well, be graded. So you'll have, outside of your second apply your knowledge question. How you doing, Benjamin? Outside
I'm
of
doing great.
Great. Outside of your second apply your knowledge assignment and your final, you'll know where you stand in the class by tomorrow afternoon. All right, any questions? Okay, great. Well, the goal is tonight to tackle the president, the presidency, tackle the bureaucracy, and be done in about 2 hours. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, depending on how fast we can get through the material. But the goal is to tackle chapter 12. We'll take a short break. That seems to work out for everybody. So 5-10 minutes. We'll kind of see where we're at on the clock. And then we'll come back. We'll cover the bureaucracy. And then we'll wrap up. We'll have some time for questions if anybody has any. But based on what I'm seeing on the exams, you know how to approach the exam, you know how to study for the exams, you know what to pull out of the text as the important issues to remember. So I think everybody's in good shape. But if you have any questions, you can ask during our class tonight, after, and then anytime you can always reach out to me outside of class. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen. I can find my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, do that. I got my chat screen up as well. So if you have any questions as we go through, or you want to participate that way, I have that going. So, all right. So chapters 12, chapters 15, that'll round us out through the final. So your final is going to be focused on chapters 11, 12, 13, and 15. Right. So we've already covered chapter 14. So just those 4 chapters, roughly the same number of questions. So there'll be more material covered per each chapter, but don't think that should be a problem. All right. So we've talked a little bit about, just in previous chapters, the electoral process, who can become president, who can run for office, what are the requirements to run for office. Each office at the federal level has some similar requirements, some requirements that differ, but they center around age, they center around residency, citizenship, as most elected office in this country do, right? The requirements, as we've talked about, they're not too complicated, right? You don't have to meet a lot of outlandish requirements to run for a particular office, even president, right? The bar, as far as the legalistic hurdles are concerned, they're pretty low, right? That doesn't mean everybody's going to run for president or everybody has the resources or will be successful, but in general, what we're talking about is the idea that if we're going to have a government of, by, and for the people, you should have the maximum number of people being able to run for office. That's the whole idea. The founders didn't want elites being the only ones, right? And we can talk about whether or not that came into existence or not. We're kind of ruled or governed by elites. But the idea was that anybody could fill these roles. Okay. So what is the process for becoming president? What are the requirements to run for president? Who can tell us? Any part of it. So what's the process for running for president? Right, either through the nomination process in the primary, the general election, how the campaign is actually completed, like what is the process for the actual selection of the president, who can become president, any requirements. Come on, I'll open it up. Anything you can share, that would be great. Let's start for requirements for being president, right? So what are some of the requirements for running for office? How old do you have to be and the like? Anybody want to share? Go ahead, Benjamin.
You have to be at least 35 to be president.
You have to be 35, right, to be president or vice
30
president.
for the Senate, 25 for the House.
You got that right. So there you go. So so 35 to run for president, vice president, right? 30 to run for the U.S. Senate, 25 to run for the House, as Benjamin had stated. What else? So you have to be a certain age. What about residency? What about citizenship? Who can help us out? Come on, these are some basic questions that would be important to know for the exam. I'll even give you a minute to look it up if you need to. How about citizenship? Who can tell us about citizenship? All right, so anybody familiar with being a natural born citizen? Right, so you have to be a natural born citizen. So you have to have citizenship, kind of be a citizen of the United States. That has to be conferred at birth, right? So you have to either be born in this country, or if you're born overseas or in a different country, whatever the case is, citizenship has to be extended to you through your parents, right? So you can be born, right? That happened with John McCain, Mitt Romney, right? You can run for, they weren't born in the country, but their parents had U.S. citizenship. So that citizenship was conferred upon them at birth, regardless of where they live. And you have to be a resident before you run, a resident for 14 years prior to running. So those are the basic requirements, right? And as far as running for president beyond meeting those requirements, right, we have a primary process, and you have to earn delegates, right, to be nominated at your party's convention. And then what happens, right? We go to the general election, right? And each state has their own election. What is each state doing? What are the voters in each state deciding? They're voting on electors, right? And those electors will in turn run for president, okay? So we have that, right? So you have Article 2, Section 1, right, lays that out. lays out the requirements. And then we've talked about the electoral process as far as the primary election, the general election, and how a candidate actually goes about winning a presidential election, right? That road to 270, earning enough electors to be selected president of the United States, right? And then of
Yep, and
course
Steve Kornacki was covering it, and then days later, enough delegates were made for Joe Scarborough to announce Joe Biden is president-elect.
There you go, right? So that's right, and we have that political process there. We've talked about the media and their role in there. That's an important role for the media. That horse race coverage on election night. When do they call states? How early do you call states? Do you wait to call states? And you kind of that road to 270, and the media is a big part of that, right? So the evolution has changed of how electors have voted. Typically, in the past, before the 12th Amendment, that basically forces president and vice president to run on the same ticket. The electors were voting separately for president and vice president. So you would have a president of one party, a vice president of another party. You had a time where the two individuals got the same number of votes because it was set up that the top vote getter would be president, okay, and then the second highest vote getter would be vice president, and that's how it was laid out. Then you had a situation where you had to go Jefferson and Burr, right? You had to go to multiple ballots in Congress to select a president. So the 12th Amendment was a way of trying to ensure that the will of the people, to eliminate any confusion about who was truly elected, but to ensure that the will of the people were being recognized, right? So you didn't have somebody that was running for vice president all of a sudden become president, things like that. Okay. All right. So the president has a lot of hats to wear, right? We talked about, you read in the text, and go back and look at the historical discussions back at the Constitutional Convention about what the chief executive, what the head of the executive branch was going to look like. What were the terms going to be? Could they be reelected? Was it going to be a one individual? Was it going to be a committee of people enacting legislation and taking on that executive function? So what the founders ultimately settled on is what we see today, right? Because there was concerns about a type of parliamentary process in which the legislature, Congress, would elect the president or an executive of some type. People were concerned about longer terms, 7-year terms being too long for individuals to serve. They could become too powerful. So it ultimately led to the discussion about the Electoral College and saying, okay, we'll put that back on the states, make sure the states still have a central role in electing the chief executive. We take it out of Congress's hands, and they ultimately decided on having one chief executive, right? There was written about in the Federalist Papers about the importance of having a individual chief executive to be able to be flexible, to be able to be responsive, reactive in emergencies, and when things needed to be done quickly, to have that individual be able to act as opposed to Congress being able to acting very slowly and deliberatively. So the chief executive could take on some of those emergency roles as the country was growing and developing. So with that being said, the individual that's elected president of the United States wears a lot of hats. There's a lot of power in that office. And so the president has what we call the head of state role. You see, we call it the ceremonial head of government. What kind of things have we seen from a ceremonial perspective when it comes to the president? What kind of things does the president do that appears more ceremonial than kind of engaging in these more formal roles like enacting legislation, signing or vetoing legislation? What kind of ceremonial things does a president do? We've seen presidents throw out the first pitch at baseball games. We've seen them put medals on civilians and members of the military. We see the president pardon turkeys at Thanksgiving, have Easter egg hunts on the White House lawn. These are all ceremonial. These aren't things that have to be done for the president to carry out his or her job, right? These are ceremonial things that we kind of expect, or that is allowed, that the president's allowed to engage in, right? Places like Britain, right? You have a head of state, and you have a prime minister, a chief executive from the government standpoint. But the Queen is the head of state, right? The ceremonial head. And so there's a lot of pomp and circumstances surrounding that, right? Those positions are separated in different countries. Here, right, we have a head of government, right? A chief executive and head of state. That's the same individual, okay? So then you have the chief executive function, right? So you have this individual who is enacting legislation that comes out of Congress. You have appointment power to do a variety of different positions within the government. You can offer reprieves, right? Essentially preventing a sentence from being enacted. You can pardon somebody, basically, if they've committed some kind of criminal act and has been convicted. You can overturn their conviction. You can commute their sentence, which you don't get rid of the conviction, but basically it's time served, right? If they have more time on their sentence, you basically commute their sentence and let them out of prison, let them off the hook. And of course, you're enacting the legislation that comes out. You're ensuring that whatever does get decided by Congress, whatever signed into law, that's being carried out in the best way possible, right? So you do that in a variety of different ways, all right? And then you have the commander-in-chief function, right? So you have a role as the head of the military. This is part of having that power of the executive being able to respond to military issues around the world. So the president has this role not only as the commander-in-chief of our federal troops, but the president can federalize the National Guard of different states as well, right? So a lot of power in this position. The president is also the chief diplomat, right? You can imagine having 535 members of Congress, right? You don't want them going out and negotiating with a variety of different countries in a variety of different ways, because you don't have the ability to really be the face of the country to kind of negotiate in good faith about different relationships around the world. So the president, as being this one individual, can engage with different countries, right? You can have different agreements. Ultimately, treaties need to be approved by the Senate, but you can negotiate a variety of different things, build relationships around the world. And right, other countries look to have that presidential recognition of their country, having that relationship with the president, right? You want to have a relationship with Congress too, but having that relationship with the president of the United States is very important, right? And then you have this, right? So there are some, variety. We call these, these are informal and formal roles, right? So head of state, right, is somewhat informal, right? You have the chief executive is a formal role, the commander-in-chief is a formal role, the chief diplomat's a formal role. The chief of party, that is more of an informal role, right? You are the top elected official in the country. You are the head of your party. You are the chief of the party. It doesn't matter the leadership within the official leadership within a party organization. It doesn't matter, right? The president sits at the top as the elected leader, the top elected official in the country of a particular party. You are the chief of the party, right? So what comes along with that, right? So there's a lot of patronage that comes along with that. Some administrations more than others. Patronage isn't necessarily something that's just held by the, that's conducted by the president, that's done in states and cities and counties and things like that. But as the president of the United States, you have a lot to offer individuals to bring in people that you trust, reward people for working hard on campaigns, rewarding individuals for votes that they've taken to support your agenda, right? So there's a variety of different things that you can offer individuals to thank them and maybe encourage them to support the things that you are doing. So we'll get into a couple other things, but I just wanted to go back and just kind of highlight the importance as you think about all these different things, right? The chief executive function, we'll talk about the chief legislative function, right? We don't normally think of the president as a legislator, but there are tools available to the president that puts him or her in the driver's seat when it comes to legislation. And we might think of the head of state as this kind of fun role, right? The president can kind of let their hair down, relax a little bit, have a little fun with the media and others, show that kind of softer side, compassionate side, all of these things. And it becomes a very important tool for the president when you're trying to carry out an agenda, when you're trying to enact an agenda, get a budget passed, when you're trying to enter into a variety of negotiations. This head of state role can be very important because you are, right, you're trying to increase your likability, your popularity. So this can be very, very influential, and we'll talk about being a chief legislator, right? But the head of state role gives you opportunities to present yourself and, as I said, soften your image a little bit, create a more positive image of the president and the president's staff to help move legislation and the policy agenda along. All right. So, like I said, right, this is the chief executive. How can the president be the chief executive and the chief legislator? Well, the president is, right. Like I said, you have these, hundreds of individuals in Congress versus the president of the United States. We see that now. What is the president's agenda? We heard about that, right? Every president going back, definitely in contemporary times. What's the president's agenda? What does the president want to enact? What is the president acting on their campaign promises, right? So, well, what are campaign promises? Campaign promises are a legislative agenda, right? So the president is working to enact through Congress their legislative agenda, right? The president presents a presidential budget to Congress, right? And when you talk about presidential budget, that you're basically looking at all the different administrative agencies within the executive branch, and you're saying, okay, this is where we're going to spend money. You're essentially, you can't do anything in government without resources. So the budget is a powerful tool because you're basically outlining where your priorities are set, right? And that goes to Congress, and Congress moves on it, takes action on it, ultimately appropriates funds of some kind. We're having a lot of those discussions now about spending money and budget appropriations. But think about what's available to the president to get that policy agenda, that public policy agenda passed, that legislative agenda passed, right? The president gets the State of the Union address. You get to go up there and, right, again, there is some ceremony to it, but it's an incredible, if you use it properly, a president can use that to talk to the country about what is important, what the president sees as important, where the priorities lie, where they're going to push, right? The media outlets cover this. People hear about it, is written about, days later after it happens. So it becomes a very powerful tool. The bully pulpit is very important, right? The State of the Union, it gives a platform, but this idea that you're one individual on stage juxtaposed to hundreds of individuals in Congress, right? You get the attention, right? So you can use that bully pulpit to call individuals out, put pressure on individuals to act a certain way. We see that going on now. This is nothing new. But right now we see President Biden traveling around the country trying to persuade individuals to put pressure on their members of Congress to enact his agenda, right? Trump did this, Obama did this. They were probably the two most active contemporary presidents at this. Biden isn't as active. Bush, I wouldn't say was nearly as active, but he used the bully pulpit, and he used the tools of going public in his war on terror, right? I wouldn't say his war on terror, but the country's war on terror, right? Saying, look, this is what we have to do. So being able to capitalize on his popularity as well, George W. Bush at the time, Obama as well, capitalizing on popularity, especially early on in his presidency, going around, right? We kind of call it the never-ending campaign, right? You don't get off the road, you just keep going. Obama loved it. He was good at it. Trump loved it. He was good at it, right? Just going out and just talking directly to the people. Both of them could draw crowds. Obviously different, drawing crowds from different segments of the population, but right, just going out and talking to people, reaching out was very powerful, and they used those tools to their advantage. So as a chief legislator, you have an official, those are kind of unofficial roles. When you talk about, you're not really you can help draft legislation or talk about what you want to see in legislation. But those aren't you're not directly involved necessarily in writing the legislation and being involved in the legislative process. But the president does have a role to play in that process, and that's vetoing or signing legislation. The president can veto legislation. In addition to a veto, the president can issue a veto message, basically talking about, basically it's an explanation of why the president vetoed the legislation. Well, this is this part of the legislation I don't agree with. This part of the legislation I do agree with, but together I can't get, I can't support it. Right, so you're basically explaining, you're telling Congress how to fix it, but you're also explaining to the public your justification for vetoing the legislation, right? And then you can also have a pocket veto. Anybody know what a pocket veto is? Who can explain a pocket veto? All right, so I'll help you out. So a pocket veto, right, is something, so a president has a certain amount of time, typically about 10 days to sign legislation, right? So the president, within that window, right, you have to sign it, veto it, or if that time lapses, it automatically goes into effect, okay? But within that window, this rarely happens because Congress, if they're going to go through all that work of passing legislation on, they're not really going to adjourn. But if within that window, before that window closes, if Congress adjourns, then the president, let's say the president doesn't want to act on the legislation, doesn't want to sign it, doesn't want to veto it, they essentially say, you know what, I'm going to pocket it, right? The Congress is out of session, and I don't have to do either, right? Congress has to be in session when that time lapses for it to go into effect. So if there's an adjournment before that window closes, I can essentially pick up that bill, put it in my pocket. We call it a pocket veto. I didn't have to sign it. I didn't have to veto it, but I essentially vetoed it, right? Because the legislation is not going to be enacted because the president didn't take action and Congress is no longer in session, right? And then of course I talked about public approval. Public approval is a very powerful tool. It's very interesting, right? So, we talk about a variety of presidents, right? Reagan, Clinton, Bush to some degree early on in his presidency, Obama as well, Trump to some degree, right? Had these presidential coattails. Right now, President Biden is struggling, right? His public approval isn't very high. So there are even members of his own party that are distancing themselves from him, right, in their own campaigns. but he's trying to go out and generate, right? Trying to do a couple of different things, trying to get his agenda passed to try to boost those numbers, but also try to boost his popularity and that approval by getting that legislation passed, right? He feels that if he can get this legislation passed, his public approval rating will go up, and time will tell. We'll see if he can get that done. We'll see if his public approval goes up. We'll see what his coattails look like in the midterm elections next year. All right. So within these roles, the president has a variety of power, right? He has emergency powers where, especially in wartime, right? We're seeing now the scope, right? Kind of Biden's testing the scope a little bit of what his presidential or his emergency powers are. We'll see where that goes. That's ultimately going to make it through into and through the courts. We'll see how that works. But right when it comes to emergency powers, Truman tried to essentially take over steel plants for the war effort. That was ruled unconstitutional. Looking at the Civil War, we talk about Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, right, claiming that that's an emergency, right? So a variety of different times, presidents have tried to invoke this emergency power, and depending on the makeup of Congress, Congress can push back or not, and the courts step in. The states also play a role in pushing back on that power as well. The presidents have access to executive orders, right? This is essentially that has the power of legislation in many instances. You're essentially spelling out action that's going to be taken, and it's the original intent of executive orders was essentially to basically spell out how legislation was supposed to be enacted. If it was vague, if it wasn't clear, or if there was a variety of different options or alternatives to enact legislation, right? The president would write an executive order and say, look, this is the directive, this is how this legislation is supposed to be carried out, and basically fill in the blanks on legislation. It's become more over the years, it's become more than that, where presidents have taken this as opportunities to act when Congress kind of frustrates the process, frustrates the president, and not being able to enact in a legislation. So the courts tend to pick those up. States typically jump in and challenge those depending on the politics of the particular situation. But they were designed to essentially clarify legislation, but it's become more than that over the years. Typically, we've had executive orders that could be overturned by succeeding presidents, but that we've had the first where you had DACA. DACA was the first executive order that I know of that the courts have actually upheld and treated as legislation that's come through the legislative process, right? So President Trump worked to scrap, he scrapped that and said, look, it's an executive order, I'm reversing the executive order, and that was made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, and the court said, no, you didn't follow a variety of different procedures, whatever the case was, and upheld DACA. So that was like the first time where an executive order wasn't overturned by the next president or succeeding president that wanted to overturn an executive order that remained in existence. So up until then, throughout our history, that's been the case where another president could overturn an executive order until that time. And then there's executive privilege, right? The idea is that the president needs to be able to, the the president has awesome power, right? Awesome responsibility. And so the president needs to be able to engage with a lot of experts, his cabinet, people that he trusts, to try to decide the best public policy solutions, approaches to take in a variety of different circumstances. So you'll see presidents invoke executive privilege, right? We saw that with recently on Capitol Hill, with General Milley and others basically saying, I can't talk to you about what I talked to the president about, right? The president, right? The idea is that the president should have the ability to be able to speak freely and have his advisors speak freely without it being every conversation coming before Congress. And so you'll see the president invoke executive privilege. It's based on this idea of the separation of powers, right? If Congress can have access to all the president's conversations at any given time, right? It puts Congress above the president. And, you know, the courts have typically ruled that way, not in every circumstance, right? You see like Nixon with the Watergate tapes, right? They said, look, no, this is outside your official role as president, right? Same thing with Clinton, right? So there's times where executive privilege wasn't honored, but if you're engaged in constitutional legal processes to carry out your function, the courts generally recognize executive privilege, right? And then, you know, like I said, the conflicts with the legislature really depends on context. Where are, you know, who has the power in Congress? What are the political affiliations? What is the homogeneity of the different political parties, right? You're seeing right now, the Democrat Party has control of Congress and the White House, but there's some there's not as the Democratic Party is not as homogenous as Biden would like to be able to move, and they don't have high, you know, large majorities to be able to push legislation through. There's, you know, schisms within the party they're trying to sort out, right? They don't have large majorities, they can't lose a lot of votes. So conflicts with the legislature, ultimately there are many, they come up even when there's unified government, but you know, the context of the makeup of the legislature matters, right? All right, so we've heard a lot of talk about impeachment over the last several years. Being talked about already in impeaching, you know, Joe Biden in some circles. So this kind of just becomes, you know, there's the concern of it becoming a tit for tat, right? Well, you impeached our guy, so we're going to impeach your guy, and back and forth it goes. But it's good to understand the process for impeachment and to understand what impeachment is. Okay, impeachment is not removal from office. Right, I've had, you know, students ask, all of you might already know that impeachment is not removal from office. But I have had students that say, I don't understand this. You know, Trump was impeached and he still got to stay in office. How is that possible? Well, that's because impeachment is actually just a indictment, right? There's an impeachment process, but actual impeachment is essentially an indictment of the president. Right, so a House Judiciary Committee, right, starts in the House. The House Judiciary Committee decides whether to proceed with impeachment. Right, they talk about it. They, if there seems to be a reason to go forward with impeachment, they draft articles of impeachment. Those articles of impeachment can pass out of committee. It can be sent to the then it's sent from the Judiciary Committee to the full House. For consideration. Articles of impeachment require just a simple majority vote in the House. Okay, if the House votes to impeach the president, right, that's comparable to, like I said, in a criminal court, an indictment. Right, you're saying maybe the grand jury came back with an indictment saying, yes, there's enough evidence to move forward to a trial. and decide this individual's guilt or innocence, right? So it's set up, the impeachment process is set up to be legalistic, right? It kind of gives the appearance of, having this, right? This process, the House is the grand jury, looks at this, deliberates, votes, right? And then if they vote to accept the articles of impeachment, approve them, then it goes to the Senate for the trial, right? So the Senate holds the impeachment trial, listen to evidence, they create the rules for the trial, the members do, and then 2/3, a supermajority vote of the Senate will result in a conviction and removal of the president, right? So that's a very difficult hurdle to pass, to overcome, right? It's designed that way, right? To say, okay, look, there's a low bar, relatively low bar in the House, but in the Senate, if you're truly going to remove a president and basically turn your back on the will of the people that voted the president into office, you really have to have something that convinces 2/3 of the Senate to vote somebody out, right? So you're looking, right? To have 67 members, that is a tough number to hit. But again, it's designed that way. You want to have consensus, a large faction of the Senate say, yeah, there's enough evidence here to remove the president, because that's a big deal, right? Within our system of government, that's a big deal to remove a president, right? So, there's been a lot of conversations about impeachment. What should count as treason, right? Because we've heard a lot about this, the language within the Constitution: treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors, right? So what constitutes those things, right? What's treason? What's bribery? There was a lot of conversations about this with Trump's first impeachment, right? What was the crime? Identifying a crime. Was this outside the purview of the president, right? His phone call, what he said on the phone call, was it treasonous? And really it was right. I think the Democrats had a hard time trying to outline what was there. Now, I think a lot of people agreed that maybe there was something amiss in the phone call, and we could argue that, but does it reach this threshold of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors? So that was a conversation that was had. But at the end of the day, the articles of impeachment can say whatever they want to say, right? It doesn't matter what they say. If you have a majority vote in the House and you vote, right, as they say, you can, can indict a ham sandwich, you can impeach a ham sandwich, right? You can impeach for any reason, right? They try to make it more formal. The House, when it does happen, in the rare circumstance it does, they try to make it a little bit more formal, make it look more formal. But at the end of the day, impeachment's a political process. And there's politics involved, and they go through this process. So whether or not it meets this threshold of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, it's in the eye of the beholder. And then there's conversations about whether policy overreach or disagreement provides grounds for impeachment. Whether it meets that threshold or not, doesn't matter. The House can take that action if the majority of the members choose. Okay? Anybody know how many presidents have been impeached? Anybody? So 3 presidents have been impeached. Anybody know their names? All right, so we've had Trump. Okay. We've had Bill Clinton. Who else? All right, the last one.
Nixon.
Say Nixon. Anybody else? So
Andrew
Nixon
Johnson.
was not. Go ahead. Say that again.
Andrew Johnson.
Andrew Johnson was, right? So very good job. So you have Andrew Johnson, right? And then Clinton was mentioned. Nixon was mentioned, and Clinton and Trump. So there's actually only been 3, right? Nixon was never impeached. Nixon actually resigned from office before the House could vote on articles of impeachment, right? So his advisors, basically, they were looking at the vote count in the House, they were looking in the Senate. Not only was he sure he was going to be impeached, he was sure that he was going to be removed from office, and he didn't want that. So he decided to resign before he faced impeachment or a trial. So it's important. That's important to know. But that's a lot of people think Nixon was impeached. Now the process was starting, right? They were going through the process. That just never reached that point. But Nixon was never impeached, right? So good job though, Benjamin Andrew Johnson, right? We forget about that, right? We talk about Reconstruction after Lincoln's assassination, right? Andrew Johnson being president. Again, very political process, right? The Republican-controlled Congress basically trying to control Andrew Johnson's cabinet by saying, the process, creating a new process for removing somebody from a cabinet office. Andrew Johnson did it, right? Somebody that was favorable to Lincoln's position, the Republicans' position as a Secretary of War, right? Johnson removed them. They said, "Oh, you violated this law we created, that we intentionally created to hamstring you, and because you violated it, we're going to impeach you." So the Congress impeached, the House impeached on a law that they created to do one of 2 things: either prevent them from Johnson from, firing the Secretary of War, or to force his hand and basically create a trap for him. It didn't work, right? How many presidents have been removed from office by means of impeachment and conviction? Absolutely none, right? It's never happened, right? So neither one. Johnson came closer than Clinton, and Trump, but nobody has ever been removed from office. Okay? All right, so I'm going to stop my share there. Okay. All right. Any questions about the president or the presidency? All right. So how does everybody feel? I have 6:47 now. You want to come back at 7 o'clock and we'll take that last hour to talk about the bureaucracy? Give me a thumbs up, or so I got a couple thumbs up here. All right. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to pause the recording, and then I said 6:48. So we'll come back at 7 o'clock and we'll finish up the last chapter. And then, like I said, I'll open it up for questions, or I'll let you get on with the rest of your evening. Okay, so we'll see you back in about 12 minutes. There he is, there's Benjamin. All right, Elizabeth's back. Everybody else back, hopefully. Awesome, great. Seeing a bunch of thumbs up, awesome. Great, okay, so my goal, like I said, in the next hour, maybe less, get through chapter 15. We'll talk about the bureaucracy. And like I said, we'll open it up for any questions about any assignments or the material in general, and then we'll call it a day. One last thing, I'm gonna, if I can, instead of waiting to the end, if I can just beg your indulgence for just 1 minute. I just want to offer my encouragement to complete evaluations that have gone out for this class. So kind of give you my little spiel about evaluation. So every time I teach this class or any other class, it's important for me to get feedback from students, because every semester is different, every class is different, the way the class is delivered, whether it be online or in class or hybrid model, whatever the case might be. It's really important for me to reflect on that particular class and that particular semester, right? So taking all those variables into consideration, it's important for me to go back and say, okay, where can I improve? What can I do better? What worked? And use what worked, continue to do it, improve upon it. Maybe what didn't work, work to fix those things. So it's very important for me as an instructor to get that feedback. So if you haven't done it already, I would just encourage you to do that. It is very much appreciated because it helps additional students, right? A lot of times professors might say they could care less about the evaluations, or maybe they want to get good evaluations, but that's the only thing they care about. For me, I need, that feedback is really important because, like I said, I want to continue to improve as an instructor in all the classes that I teach. And look, at the end of the day, you have a front row seat, and you contribute to that process by saying, hey, look, this is what's good, what's bad. And that way I take that information and move forward. And the next students that I meet, the goal is for them to benefit from that. So if you could do that, that would be great. It's very much appreciated. All right, that's my spiel. And let's go back to, where is my PowerPoint? Okay, here we go. All right, so going into our last chapter. I know bureaucracy isn't the most exciting way to end the semester, but keep in mind that I teach a class on public administration, and even within this course, it's important to think about all the different things that you've learned and see how the bureaucracy fits in. Because the bureaucracy, we hear that name, that term bureaucracy, and it has a negative connotation. But the bureaucracy is very important to achieving policy outcomes, right? And the engagement with the leadership in the executive branch, with Congress, with outside interest groups, with the public. The bureaucracy is at the center of all of those interactions in one shape or form. So it's very important to understand not only what the bureaucracy does, but its interaction with different branches of government, but also the public and other outside agencies like states and local governments and nonprofits that the bureaucracies work with. So encourage you not to think about bureaucracy just being, it's just boring, mundane, paper pushing and just moving things around. This is how we see all those debates in Congress about what we should do and how we should spend money and what's important to the country and how we should move forward, right? Those conversations don't go anywhere. That we don't see those ideas come to fruition until the bureaucracy gets their hands on that public policy and enacts it. That's how important the bureaucracy is. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about that, and think about, right, why the amount of power that the bureaucracy has, important ways to look at the reforms of the bureaucracy to ultimately get the public policy that we think will benefit different regions or the country as a whole, right? All right, so a bureaucracy, like I said, it's a pejorative term. We say it's the bureaucracy. It's a place, we think about red tape and a bunch of regulations that are hard to cut through. They're inflexible, and they're just hard to deal with, right? You can't get answers. It's hard to get somebody to take responsibility and to give you answers. But take a step back, right? When we think about bureaucracy, what we're talking about is just essentially a large organization that's structured in a hierarchy, and it just carries out specific function. That's the generic term for a bureaucracy. And these units within an organization, they're divided according to specializations and expertise of the employees, right? So you have different agencies within, let's say, the federal government, right? The Department of Education, Agriculture, Department of Justice, right? All of these things, all of these different departments, they have different segments, different units within the organization. They're very complex units. And you bring in people that are good at what they do within those organizations, right? Because that's what you want to see in a bureaucracy. That's the goal, is to bring in experts. Again, looking on the negative side of a bureaucracy, sometimes we just got done talking about patronage, and right, that exists, right? Patronage exists, and there's no question about that. But as we'll talk about in just a little bit here, we've had this development of civil service, this idea to get the best people into these positions, to bring expertise to the table, to solve problems, and to implement legislation in the best way possible, right? And of course, within these organizations, there's division of labor. So think about that, right? You have a chief executive, and then you have department heads and middle managers and frontline workers, right? We can see these. We typically think of these as like an organizational chart. And it starts, you have the management at the top, flowing down to everybody, all the way down to the frontline workers within the organization, right? The executive organization in the federal government, right, is made up of, and we'll talk through the different agencies and the different departments, but we first start with the cabinet, right? So what's the cabinet? Can anybody tell us what the president's cabinet is? Right, so these are political appointees, right? So they go through this nomination and confirmation process. What do the members of the cabinet do? Right. So when we think about cabinet members, some of those things, right? We think about the attorney general. We talk about the head of the Department of Education, right? So there's a couple different functions, right? There's an advisory function of these individuals. They're selected by the president to aid in decision making. The cabinet includes heads of 15 executive departments and others named by the president. So the president can designate somebody as cabinet rank when it comes to different policy, maybe different policy issues. So saying to ascribe cabinet rank to somebody is important because you can say, look, this is somebody important in my administration, so I'm going to give them cabinet rank because they're going to lead the charge on whatever particular issue that there is. So these cabinet members have this dual role within the administration, within the presidential administration. So they have to advise the president on their particular, policy area, but they also have to run an agency and operate this particular agency. And that can be very difficult for heads of these secretaries to manage, because you have to be able to interact with your managers within that department. You have expertise in that field, presumably. So you might care about the policies that are coming out of that department, and you care about maintaining a functioning department. Sometimes that can put you at odds with the president. So that can be, even though you're an advisor, that can put you in a difficult position. Okay. So we look at the executive organization, the members of the cabinet, right? The Secretary of State, the Treasury, Defense, Attorney General, Secretary of the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Housing and Urban Development, right? HUD, if you've ever heard HUD, that's what we're talking about. Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans, and lastly, Homeland Security, coming out of the September 11th attacks in 2001, right? The idea that there was gaps in information. So the Department of Homeland Security was created to pull in all these different agencies under one umbrella with the goal of streamlining information to hopefully eliminate or reduce those gaps in information, right? So this is, when we think about the cabinet, the formal cabinet, this is what we're talking about. And these have grown, right, over the years, right? So you start, right, the Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, and Attorney General. At the time when it was created, the Secretary of Defense was called the Secretary of War. But you had these four to begin with, and then it grew from there, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about Health and Human Services. So the executive organization, as I said, you can ascribe cabinet rank to others, right? That shows that they have an important job within the administration. And then that's kind of like the formal executive organization. And then what we call the kitchen cabinet. Has anyone ever heard this term, kitchen cabinet? And can you tell us what that means? Anybody? So the kitchen cabinet, right, is we talk about, so in politics and in political campaigns, right, we talk about this, right? The campaigns that I've run for other individuals, the campaigns that I've run myself, like I've been the candidate. There's, you have these two kind of parallel organizations, even within a campaign. You have these people that are, kind of, you bring people aboard because they have influence in the community. You want them to be associated with the campaign. And so you bring them on board as kind of maybe an official role in the organization, maybe speaking for the campaign, things like that. But outside of that, these people that can benefit your campaign in a variety of different ways, you have your kitchen cabinet. These are your closest advisors. These are the people that you trust to have a discussion around the kitchen table, right? So that's what you call it. That's why you got the nickname, the kitchen cabinet, because these are people that you'll sit around in your kitchen, the dining room table, and say, okay, hey, let's hash this out. What's this? What's some strategy here, right? That's a close-knit group, right? You have to be very careful in politics about who you trust, right? And so people are very closely guarded about who they're going to bring into their kitchen cabinets, right? And so you have this kind of formal group, you have this informal group of advisors, and the presidential use of cabinets is discretionary, right? There's nothing that says that the president has to listen to their Secretary of Education on this particular policy. The president doesn't have to consult anybody in his cabinet, her cabinet, before they make a decision. And so, right, the president might not, right? If you're focused on energy policy, right, you're not going to necessarily focus on other policies. So you might not have as much engagement with the HUD secretary or health and human services. So where your priorities lie, right, are the individuals that you tend to interact with on more often, because that's where your policy agenda is heading, right? And as I already talked about, there's conflicts of interest within the cabinet, and that could, that relationship can be strained, and right, that can create conflicts within the administration, right? All right, so moving past the cabinet, you have the executive office of the president. So this is an organization established by FDR to assist the president carrying out major duties and coordinate the executive bureaucracy, right? So you're saying, okay, what's going on outside? You have the sprawling federal bureaucracy. How do we coordinate activities? How do we coordinate that with my staff, my agenda, right? So you have this office, right? Because all of these agencies are operating independently, right? What brings them together, right? Who they report to. And the president, right? It's gotten too complex. The president can't, right? The president has so many other things to do, so you can't focus on operating those departments and checking in with your cabinet every day. So you have this executive office of the president that you're trying to coordinate all of these activities, right? And then you have the White House office. This is the personal office of the president, which they address the president's political needs, manages the media, right? So these are the people working in the White House. We talk about the press secretary, the chief of staff, and on we go, right? So this is, right, carrying out the functions of the day-to-day of the president. What's on our agenda today? What's our process today? Where, right? And there's advisors involved in that and all sorts of things, but these are the people that are closest to the president on a daily basis, right? And then I talked about the permanent campaign, right? So the permanent campaign comes out of the White House office. They're driving the daily, the weekly agenda. And so they're coordinating where the president's going to go, what the president's going to say, what they're going to talk about that day, what they want to focus on, how they're going to carry out that message, right? Is it going to be a site visit somewhere, or is it going to be a press conference? What is it going to be? So that's all coming out of the White House office. Okay. All right. So in the White House office, you have the Office of Management and Budget. You had the OMB assists the president preparing the annual budget, right? That they present to that the president submits to Congress. They clear all the executive departments' budgets, right? Looking them through, and they supervise the administration of the federal budget. You have the National Security Council. It's an agency in the executive office of the president that advises the president on national security issues. And then you can have policy czars, right? This is an indication of what the president's policy, what their policy preferences are, what their priorities are. So when you appoint a czar, a policy czar, saying, okay, look, we're going to look at, renewable energy, right? And this is going to be my policies are on that. What you're doing is highlighting the importance of that within your administration. And you're saying this is an important part of the agenda, right? The vice presidency in all of this, right? What's the vice president's role in all of this, right? So politically, the job of the vice president is to ideally is to strengthen the ticket, right? When you're running for office. But outside of that, right, you have this formal job of, right, you're the president of the Senate. But how often is the vice president operating as the president of the Senate? Not very often, right? So the vice president has the role of just in general, generally speaking, supporting the president in whatever priorities those might be, right? So you had Vice President Harris recently be assigned to deal with what the Biden administration calls root causes of, right, immigration at the southern border. What are these root causes? And that's a job that she's working on, right? That's not something that's assigned through the Constitution or through statute. The president just said, look, Vice President Harris, I need you to work on this, go work on it, right? And then there's going to be times where the president, the vice president is going to continue to be a tie-breaking vote in the Senate, right? So the vice president can cast a vote in the Senate in cases of a tie. So that's why, right? That's the only reason the Democrats have control of the chamber right now in the Senate, because they have a Democratic vice president, right? So in a 50-50 split chamber, right? The vice president, also known as the secretary, the Senate president, breaks those ties, right? Okay. Something that, right, is gone through Congress. Congress has had to consider is presidential succession. This having continuity in government is very important, right? And the structure of the federal bureaucracy, that hierarchy. The 25th Amendment talks about what happens in cases of a disability. So this amendment established procedures for filling the presidential and vice presidential vacancies if they ever are created, because of a disability. So when the vice presidency becomes vacant, that's obviously a lot different than when the presidency is vacant, right? There's a vacancy in the Oval Office. So when the vice presidency that office is vacant, the president can nominate a VP who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority of both houses of Congress. Does the president have to do that? No. So the president can take their time doing that, not drag their feet, whatever the case might be, but that's kind of the presidential prerogative, right? And then there's of course the 1947 Succession Act that says, look, and when this happens, what is the presidential succession going to be? So I can go through this, but right, when it comes to presidential succession, this is the presidential succession, right? VP, Speaker of the House, the Senate, President pro tem, right? The temporary Senate president, right? When in the absence of the vice president in the Senate, there's somebody that's the president pro tem, Senate, temporary president for the day, whatever you want to call it, right? So it goes to there. right? And then it goes down the line, Secretary of State, Treasury, on and on and on and on and on we go. And so you look at these lists, right? Okay, VP, Speaker of the House, right? Senate Pro Tem, that makes sense. Okay, Secretary of State, sure. Treasury, Defense, Attorney General, okay, and then Interior, right? Okay, does that make sense? Agriculture, why are they in this order? Well, they're in this order because that was the order in which they were created. So the decision was made to say, look, we will create succession instead of trying to say, hey, which is more important? Which office is more important in the line of succession? Just saying, look, at the time that they were created, that's where they'll fall in line as far as the line of succession goes. All right. Okay. So the going back to bureaucracy and kind of comparing those things, we will kind of talk about, kind of compare public and private bureaucracies. So in a public bureaucracy, right, because of the way our system of government is set up, you have multiple leaders, right? The goal is to separate powers, to create checks and balances, right? To create this, essentially this conflict. So you have multiple leaders, President, Congress, others. The goal is to serve citizens. So it's a different purpose than maybe a private entity does. It's not organized for profit. You look at a private enterprise, right? It's a single set of leaders. It's designed to be streamlined, have decisions made, sent down from those leaders to the workers to implement their decisions, right? And they're organized to make a profit. So the system in which these players operate makes a difference into what the public policy, what is going to look like ultimately, and what the bureaucracy has to look like. What it's going to look like. All right, so scholars, public administration scholars, sociologists, they've looked, political scientists have looked at bureaucracy and try to look at how do bureaucracies operate, right? What are the motivations, what are the outcomes of these organizations, right? And the goal was to make them better, right? To understand these organizations so that they could improve upon them, right? What structure works best? What line of authority works best? What type of participation of the players within that bureaucracy does that matter? So trying to understand organizations to ultimately say, okay, this is how a bureaucracy should operate, right? Try to come up with a theory of bureaucracy so you can say, okay, this is how agencies in this particular situation dealing with these issues, this is how it should operate to achieve maximum efficiency and effectiveness. So Max Weber or Weber came up with this Weberian model, and he viewed bureaucracies as rational, hierarchical organizations in which decisions are based on logical reasoning, right? So this is the first attempt at trying to understand bureaucracy, right? The goal, this bureaucracy, it's hierarchical, right? These authority is important within these organizations. They're rational, saying, okay, this is the individual at the top. They're giving me a command. We're going to carry out that command to achieve this, right? They're looking at the goal of the organizations. They're trying to come up with the best alternative. They'll weigh the pros and cons of all these different alternatives. They'll implement the best alternative, and that'll be how they carry out the best public policy, right? Very rational approach to making decisions, right? And he saw this as bureaucracies as apolitical organizations, right? You have these experts, they're given a job to do, you bring in good people, they'll act in a rational way, they'll find the right solutions, and they'll enact them, right? We don't normally think of bureaucracies that way, right? Especially, right, kind of looking for efficiencies, right? And right, the more we've learned about bureaucracies, the fact that we could even consider them apolitical is kind of gone out the window, right? So this administration political dichotomy doesn't exist, right? You can't separate the two, right? So the acquisitive model, of bureaucracy. Use top-level bureaucrats as seeking to expand the size of their budgets and staffs to gain greater power. So now we're starting to get an idea of, right? It's not just looking at the structure and saying, okay, this is the structure, this is how it has to operate. These are the amount of managers we need. These are the amount of frontline people. These are the experts that we need. Okay, we'll make decisions. We'll kind of all figure that out, and then we'll do what's best for the policy, and we'll run the organization that way. This is looking at the people. We start to looking at the people within these organizations and how, and that human component, how important that is, right? So you have leaders, right, for a variety of different reasons. They care about the cause, job security, whatever the case might be. They're looking to improve this, increase the size of their budgets, and they want to have more power to be able to maybe expand the scope of the things that they're doing, right? So, right, we're starting to look at the personal motivations of individuals, right? So just trying to understand, like, in none of these, right, these approaches aren't mutually exclusive, right? Do you need a hierarchy? Do you need a hierarchy like Max Weber talked about, a hierarchy that deals with authority and the relationships between supervisors and frontline workers? Yes, that's important. Is that the whole story? No, right? You have to also think about leadership and what their motivations are, and how do you keep them on task? How do you prevent them from going off task? So these are mutually exclusive. All of these have nuggets of truth to them, right? Then you have the monopolistic model, and this compares bureaucracies to monopolistic business firms, right? So if you lack competition, you increase inefficient and costly operations, right? So we start to look at, when we see about reforms, we'll talk about privatization, right? And this is the idea of saying, okay, well, right, if some of the problems with bureaucracy stem from the lack of competitiveness, okay, how can we inject some competitiveness in the process? And privatization was one thought about, bureaucratic reform that's been implemented time and time again, a lot at the local level, state level, but the federal level as well, right? So just different ways to look at bureaucracies and trying to understand how they operate. Why do we want to understand how they operate? Because we want to improve them, right? The goal is to improve them. All right, so type of agencies. You have administrative agencies, right? So these are federal, state, local government units, and they're set up, they're designed by whatever legislative body exists at that level to carry out a specific function, right? So these legislative bodies create them, they authorize them to do certain things, and then they provide, they enforce, these agencies enforce specific laws. Right? And that's grown. I mean, you talk about administrative agencies, cabinet staff, right? We'll go and talk about some other government corporations and things like that, right? The country's grown, more people. It's been more spread. The country's more spread out, more complex, very complex, important issues that the bureaucracy has to deal with, right? So it's expanded substantially, right? If you think about the beginning size of the federal government, it's staggering, right? You look at 50 employees, 9 employees at state, 2 employees at Department of War, 39 employees at the Treasury, right? Then you look at the current operation, right? 2.7 million, roughly, civilian federal employees. Then you have millions of subcontractors. And then you look at the state and local governments, just millions more government employees. So the bureaucracy has expanded, right? You're settling more territory. The population is growing. Issues are more complex. So the bureaucracy is going to go to be able to address those issues. So we've already talked about the cabinet department, right? So these, we call these line agencies, right? So line organizations, right? They're directly accountable to the president. They report directly to the president. They're responsible there, right? So you have these administrative agencies, you have cabinet departments, you have independent executive agencies, right? So this is a federal agency. It's not part of a cabinet department that reports directly to the president, right? So these are more independent. Ultimately, they do report to the chief executive, the president, but there is some more independence, right? So you take them out of, this is an issue maybe that's been, you know, it's requires more expertise than and more specialization than a cabinet department could provide. So, right, Congress creates an independent agency to work on a specific series of issues and bring in experts to deal with that. So independent regulatory agencies fall within that. And so it's an agency, again, outside the major executive departments, and they're charged with implementing, you know, making and implementing rules and regulations. So, you know, you have different departments outside that, you know, cabinet chain. Say, okay, look, we're going to deal with these kind of specific issues and implementing regulations. The idea is that you're bringing in experts to create regulation that's necessary to ensure safety and security in a variety of different instances. The purpose of the regulatory agency is, and we've talked about this before, Congress has been unable to, because of the political environment, not only they don't have the capacity, right, the knowledge to address these issues specifically, but the political environment doesn't allow Congress to handle the complexities and the technical issues to deal with very complex issues. So what they do is they say, okay, look, we're going to have this, create this agency, this regulatory agency to set up, right, to deal with the environment or deal with whatever the case might be, and say, okay, look, we are going to give you the ability to do this, to regulate this industry, because we just don't have the capacity to do it. We don't have the knowledge, but also if we try to get into specific regulations within our legislation, it would never pass, right? Legislation has, you know, a record, especially in the, you know, contemporary times, of being vague, because if it wasn't vague, it would never get passed, right? So vagueness in legislation helps it pass because, you know, it gives people cover, says, okay, well, this can mean a lot of different things. We'll kind of punt it to the bureaucracy, the different agencies to handle, okay? And what can be very, right, this, which given folks a lot of concern, right? There's some benefits and drawbacks, right? So one of the benefits is that these agencies carry, you know, they basically carry they carry out functions of all three branches of government, right? So they implement regulation. If there's a complaint or something, you know, something like that, they adjudicate these issues, right? So they create regulation, they implement the regulation, they adjudicate issues, right? So they're taking on the role of all these layers of government, which allows the three branches of government, and that allows them to act quickly, right? To move quickly, to be responsive. But at the same time, the argument is that the people argue that, you know, that's the danger in it, right? That's a benefit, but that's also a danger, that they have this flexibility to be able to do all of these things and they can move quickly, which, right, that's not necessarily, you know, that can lead to, you know, additional power grabs, right, for different agencies, and that can become problematic. All right. So within these independent executive agencies, the biggest concern is agency capture, right? So the act by which an industry being regulated by government agency gains direct or indirect control over agency personnel or decision makers, right? You build these relationships over time, right? You have maybe people that come from your industry, go to work within that agency. And over time, you essentially capture this agency, and the regulations maybe are more beneficial than they should be, right? Maybe they're not, maybe inspectors don't, you know, maybe they turn the other, you know, they turn their head. They don't look at every issue. Maybe they give you a pass on some issues because of this, you've essentially captured this agency in a variety of different ways to where you've built these relationships, and those relationships can prevent agencies from doing the job that they were assigned. All right. And we have government corporations. So government corporations, we look at Amtrak, the U.S. Postal Service, right? So these are kind of a quasi business enterprise, and they're used to carry out activities that are primarily commercial, right? So the U.S. Postal Service is the largest employer after Walmart, right? There's a lot of things, a big job to do. So they provide this service. There's kind of a, right, they're subsidized, but also there's this quasi business enterprise component of it, right? All right, so we talk about, right, that's kind of the breadth, the scope, the description of the bureaucracy. So kind of talk about the challenges and attempts to reform the different the bureaucracies, right? Try to create more efficiencies, try to cut down on inefficiencies, corruptions, bad practice. So let's look at the challenges of a bureaucracy, right? And this is kind of like a two-edged sword, right? They're complex and they're specialized. Well, we think, okay, that's good, right? I mean, if they're complex, then maybe they can look at complex issue. They're specialized. You have experts there. Well, the problem is that we have an information gap, right? So we think about this as kind of a principal and agent relationship where you have Congress that's giving these agencies money, right? And their budgets, they're giving them power to do all these things. But guess what? Congress readily admits that they can't handle these complex issues. So the fact that these agencies are specialized and complex means that Congress can't understand what they're doing, right? Trying to figure out what they're doing, how they're going about solving a problem can become very difficult, right? So, and the fact that it's complex makes it difficult to kind of oversee, provide oversight for these agencies, right? It's not only they're dealing with complex issues, but they're complex, right? They're large, complex organizations. So trying to provide oversight is difficult. There's separate missions, goals, constituents, right? So all these different agencies within the agencies, they're going in all of these different directions. You can have overlapping jurisdictions. And then you have problems that no one agency can solve. So you have these issues, right? That was one of the things with the Department of Homeland Security, right? Each agency was siloed and kind of working independently, and there was turf wars and all of these different things. So trying to bring that under one umbrella was trying to overcome these problems that no one agency could solve, right? So we talk about terrorism and Homeland Security, right? Okay, dealing with natural disasters, right? How do you deal with them? How do you respond to them? Think about the responses to COVID, right? Was the country ready? How could it have been, right? We'll do a post-mortem on it at some point. How could the country have been more ready? How could it have been more responsive? How do we address this the next time? Okay. All right, so to give a brief, I don't want you to worry too much about the history of the civil service, right? I want you to take some important information away from it, but understand this in terms of why the civil service was implemented. Go ahead, Benjamin. Did you have a question, Benjamin?
What about the Secret Service?
What about the Secret Service?
Are they civil service too?
They are. So the civil service is, right? So we talk about political appointments, and then we talk about career civil service. So, right, these are experts, right? They're in the hiring, firing, the promotion, the merit component, which we'll talk about, are in there. So the Secret Service, just like in, you have different law enforcement type agencies. There's a mix of political appointments and civil service employees that are more of these career experts in their field. But good question, right? So think about civil service in terms of what the intent was, right? The intent was to try to prevent the corruption of political appointees, right? Trying to make sure you had the best people in the federal government and state and local government too. You had these people in place to, with certain expertise to be able to implement public policy in the best way possible, okay? So whether or not we can agree whether or not, we can agree or discuss or disagree about whether the civil service is too stringent as far as being able to hire, fire, promote, whatever the case is, different individuals. But let's think about it in terms of the intent, right? So, in Andrew Jackson, right, we're talking about, 1828, right? There was this kind of this policy, this unwritten kind of rule where just understood that to the victor goes the spoils, right? So if you win public office, like, okay, what are some of the spoils? The spoils are creating public policy that you support, giving friends jobs, right? All of these things that go into it. So we talk about the spoils in terms of civil service, this conversation as far as staffing the bureaucracy, right? The jobs that you can give away, right? Because you're people that are going to, you want to give people jobs that are going to support you, go along with what you want to do, all of these different things, right? So we talk about the spoil system, right? So you award government jobs to political supporters and friends, right? So that's how you get people to work for you, and that still goes on today. I mean, that's you can't completely get rid of the spoil system, right? There's fewer, spoils types, staffing jobs, but it still absolutely exists. That's how you get a lot of people working on the campaign, right? You get some high level people working on a higher level campaign that, if you're successful, that a lot of times that turns into staffing jobs. So that's important for a lot of folks, right? So if you look at, 1828, you're going down now to, so that was kind of in effect, this idea of the spoil system, right? So I won, I get to do what I want now, right? I ran the campaign, I was voted in, so I should be able to get to do what I want to do and put my people in place to do what I want them to do. Well, in 1883, the Civil Service Reform Act came in, right? This idea that, okay, well, there's corruption, coming in, you don't have the qualified people coming in to operate government, all of these concerns, right? So it implements this merit system, right? So you have selection, retention, promotion of government employees based on competitive examinations, right? And we still see this today, civil service exams, right? Testing people. Do you qualify? Do you have the knowledge to do this job or don't you? Right? So this is just one way in which, reformers are trying to make sure you have the best people in, federal employment jobs, right? Then came the Pendleton Act, right? So it was established, it established the principle of employment on the basis of merit and created the Civil Service Commission to administer the personnel service. So again, all right, so we create this, we recognize that merit is important. How are we going to enforce this? Okay, we're going to create the Civil Service Commission. All right, so building on finding out ways to improve the civil service. The Civil Service Commission was the central personnel agency of the federal government at that time, right? So looking at, right, how can we enforce this? How can we make sure we get the best people? How do we sort out the qualified people from the not so qualified people? We come all the way to the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. And this abolished the Civil Service Commission and created two separate federal agencies to perform its duties. So you have the Office of Personnel Management, and then you have the Merit Systems Protection Board, right? So looking at ways to where you have, if someone feels like they weren't promoted or somebody was promoted that didn't have their qualifications, right? You had an outlet to say, okay, let's challenge it. Let's have a group of overseers look at that. So you have the Office of Personnel Management looking at these things. Who are the best people, qualifying people, giving them ratings. We see a rating system within the federal government, right? What's your, GS rating, things like that, and then trying to determine, right? And then
The
having
NRA has a lot of ratings too, from A to F.
Say
Mine
that
will be
again?
F. The
Say
NRA
that
has
again?
letter ratings too,
Yeah, so we
like
have,
A
so we
through
talked,
F.
yeah, so
Mine
we
will be
talked about
F.
that in, you said you would be an F? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so we're talking about like ratings in two different contexts, right? So ratings as far as like competence within a particular field or experience, expertise kind of thing. And then the ratings game, we talked about those are more in an electoral context, or the NRA and other organizations, they say, okay, well, Benjamin's, he gets an F rating, right? So he's not good on the Second Amendment, right? As far as we're concerned. Right. Other groups like the Brady campaign think that an F rating from the NRA is a badge of honor. Right. So yeah, these competing things. But so two different things, right? They're both ratings, but there's different different contexts. So you have these agencies, right, that are looking to how do we ensure that this merit system is robust, right? We're highlighting the most qualified. If for some reason internally, people that think they were qualified didn't get a fair shake, we have a system to adjudicate those issues. In addition, like I said, going to bring the best people, but also keeping the politics out. Right there with FDR, right? That was a big concern with FDR, not only the scope of the government, and the issues of federalism that were tied up there. But the new army of civil servants, right? How is politics going to play a role in all these new programs and departments being created? The federal employees, dealing with those issues, you have the Hatch Act of 1939, and this prohibited federal employees from engaging in the management of political campaigns. So this was ultimately ruled unconstitutional, kind of in part, right? So federal employees can there's things that they can do and engage in nonpartisan elections and things like that. You can't, court said you can't prevent them from engaging in political campaigns in any respect, but right, you can, there are some limits, right? You don't want to have somebody engaging in the kind of the party politics seem to be a problem. The FEPA of 1993 amended the Hatch Act, so employees can run in nonpartisan elections, participate in voter registration drives. They can make campaign contributions to political organizations, and they can campaign for candidates in partisan elections, right? So just saying, look, okay, there are some limits, but we're going to recognize that there are some, right? We can't take away federal employees' free speech rights. So there are some limits, right? We're trying to find ways in which to uphold the First Amendment for these individuals, but also root out corruption in, federal employment hiring. Okay. All right. So I asked this. Maybe Benjamin or somebody else has a thought on this, right? So some people note that the spoils system easily becomes corrupt. Does the current merit system allow corruption, or do the problems with the merit system not include corruption? Which system do you prefer and why? So if you had to choose between a more merit-based system and a spoils system, what do you think is best? Anybody have a thought? All right, so I'll put this out there. Maybe somebody wants to challenge me. So I consider myself a spoils guy, right? I would err on the side of spoils, especially in the era of big complex government, where you have a big complex bureaucracies, large administrative agencies, and you have what we look at as an imperial presidency, right? You have these agencies, the bureaucracy, the executive agencies are so large that the president really doesn't even have control over what these agencies do, because you have these career civil service that they have they have political affiliations, right? And they might not always want to go along with what the president wants them to do. And so there's ways that they can put in roadblocks to the president and the president's agenda. That's why, enacting an agenda is so difficult. You have a lot of political players, but these agencies aren't above politics either. And just because they fall in the chain of command doesn't mean that they're going to fall in line. So if a president's elected to carry out an agenda, and this goes for, mayor, county president, governor, whatever the case might be, why shouldn't that individual be able to say, okay, look, I'm in all of these different positions. I'm putting somebody that I can trust to carry out my agenda. So I should be able to hire and fire anybody I want because they're not following, they're not doing what I need them to do. Or they're slow walking something, or they're putting up roadblocks, or being non-responsive. So that's my argument for the spoil system, right? If I have problems enacting my agenda because of career civil servants, right? Okay, so maybe you have somebody that has expertise somewhere, and that's good, and they have experience in government. Okay, that could be good. But what about if they're not listening to the directives of cabinet members and the president of the United States, right? Is that their job? Maybe you think that maybe that's their job to stand up as experts, maybe to stand up against the president and cabinet members. Anybody want to take a position on the other side? All right, I'll let you off the hook, but think about it, right? What's important, right? Is the civil service, system lived up to its goals, its lofty goals? I don't know. Like I said, I think about this imperial presidency where you have the federal bureaucracy has gotten so complex that it's hard to manage and control. All right, so let's think about, right? So what are these, right? If you think about agencies not operating as efficiently as they could, right? You try to study agencies, how do they work? How do they operate? What do we do when there's a problem? How do we ensure that we find the problem right away as soon as we can, and so we can be responsive to it? So there's been some attempts at reform. One has been sunshine laws. Sunshine laws are a goal. The goal is to increase transparency. All right. So when we talk about the government and the Sunshine Act of 1976, the directive, one of the major directives was for directed federal agencies to conduct all their business regularly in public session, right? What's the idea behind that? Well, public session, there's more eyes on you, people from the public, the newspapers, different interest groups, they can have their eyes on what you're doing, and you're letting the sunshine in, right? Talk about sunshine being the best disinfectant. You're creating transparency, letting people know what's going on. So if the more eyes you have on it, you can identify problems before they become a problem, stop problematic policies from being enacted, things like that. So things like FOIA, we talk about, information disclosure beginning in the 1960s with FOIA, right? The Freedom of Information Act, being able to request information, right? Only having very few limits as far as what information government can hold back. There are, right, after September 11th with terror, as it relates to terrorism and homeland security issues, the courts have allowed some additional information be held back, but for the most part, the courts err on the side of disclosure, right? So federal agencies, state agencies, county, city agencies having to provide information when asked. Okay, so that's sunshine, right? Let's let the sunshine in. Let's get more eyes on it. Let's identify problems. Okay, so that's one attempt. Sunset laws were also used. So we talk about a sprawling bureaucracy and trying to provide oversight of all these different agencies, all these different programs can be very difficult. Not only because it's so large and complex, but because members of Congress might not be interested in it, might not have the time to deal with it, or involved in a variety of other issues. Hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of legislation coming across their desks in a term or in any given year. So they're trying to keep up with their job as legislators. They're doing re-election stuff. They're raising money. They're being a good partisan person, and all these different activities. So oversight is difficult. So one idea that came about was to have legislation sunset, right? So existing programs, they have a clock, right? And this legislation, these programs would sunset, right? They would go, right? And so it would have to come back to Congress and say, okay, well, you need to re-up. You really need to renew this legislation if you want it to continue to go. And what that would do is that would trigger members of Congress to say, oh, okay, let's go look at it and see they're on the clock and they're about to run out of time. So let's look at this program. Has it worked? What were the goals? What were the initial goals? How did it go about meeting its goals? Was it successful? How successful? What do we need to change? Do we need to discontinue the program? Right? So it's creating implementing these triggers to force Congress to look at these programs. We talked about privatization, right? When we talk about this monopolistic model of bureaucracy, what is it about public administration agencies that create this monopolistic environment, right? They're inefficient because they can be, right? They don't have to compete with anybody. So how can we create some competitiveness? So privatization was the idea behind that, right? So the replacement of government services with services provided by private firms. The goal was to say, okay, compete for our business, right? And then we can watch what you do, and you're a private enterprise, so you're going to be as efficient as you can to be able to maximize your grant in whatever program this is. So you contract for services, be vouchers for housing. It's most successful at the local level when you're dealing with very specific programs like waste management, things like that. It's very difficult as you broaden the scope at the state level, the federal level, because you still have problems with oversight as it relates to private organizations. And you could privatize, and there's private companies out there that don't have much competition either, depending on the region you're in or the industry you're in. So sometimes there isn't as much competition in the private sector as you would think. So scholars have looked at that and said, look, well, the privatization is not necessarily the answer because there's not always competitiveness within the private sector either. And so that's another way, privatization, right? Try to increase efficiency, competitiveness, right? Things like that. And then incentives providing incentives for efficiency and productivity. Bonuses for agencies with budget surpluses. Government, we look at the Government Performance and Results Act of 1997. Agencies were required to describe goals and establish methods to determine whether the goals were met, right? So saying, okay, you need to accomplish this. How are you going to go about doing it? And then show us how you're going to measure it, right? So this kind of measurement approach to public administration, all right? So we're going to, right, let's look at how we measure success. So they're trying to look at, right? They look at through a budgetary component, right? Providing incentives, but also saying, look, performance as well, and looking like, how do we measure this? How do we know that's the right measure? Even with all these attempts, bureaucracy has changed very little. Problems attributed to the bureaucracy are the result of political decision-making quite often, right? The Congress not being clear-cut, decisions not being clear or described properly, untrained political appointees heading agencies, right? So individuals that don't have maybe the expertise or the knowledge about how of the specific subject matter or how the federal bureaucracy operates can impede bureaucracies from changing and becoming more efficient and effective. So not just about, so we look at these kind of reforms as from a program perspective, right? Is the program working, right? The things that we want you to do, is it working? So what are you sending out into the world? What service are you sending out into the world to serve constituents? Are you doing that? Are you doing it well? Is it solving the problem? So it's the reform or the review, the oversight has been, you looked at it from a program perspective, the program evaluation perspective, but internally within the agency, the reformers have also looked at, right, let's create efficiency within the operation as well, right? So the Paperwork Elimination Act of 1998 saying, okay, right, we using this technology to streamline communication, to streamline production, save on paper, the printing, the filing, the shuffling of paperwork, right? Is that a way we can spend? So that kind of, right, you need to carry out a program, you need these things, but are there ways within the operation of carrying that out that we can tweak? So there's been attempts at that, right? And there's kind of in the big scope of everything, it's not, you're not saving a ton of money there. Some, but not a ton, right? All right, so we look at all of the things that we talked about up till now are, as it relates to kind of program evaluation, has been based on people outside looking in, okay, for the most part, right? So reformers are also looked at, well, how about we get in touch with the people on the inside, right? We give them opportunity to blow the whistle, right? We talk about whistleblowers, blowing the whistle on a problem within an agency, okay? So whistleblower, you're going to bring attention to inefficiency or illegal action. And so Congress has tried to protect these whistleblowers, right? With prohibiting reprisals if you whistleblow, and just a variety of different ways, through the special, the Office of the Special Counsel, providing monetary awards, things like that to encourage and protect whistleblowers, to create reforms. Okay?
Yeah, but the whistleblowers trying to go after the president for high crimes and misdemeanors.
Say that again?
The whistleblowers look for high crimes and misdemeanors to accuse the president of.
They can, right? We had that with Trump's first impeachment, right? That was a big thing, right, about a whistleblower. So yeah, so that, whistleblowers are not necessarily just targeting or looking at a president, but just, it can range from that down to how a agency is operating, or if there's kickback schemes like illegal activity, things like that. So, but good point, right? So whistleblowers can, right, have, right, it's important to ensure that they're protected, right? So we can understand that. Now, right, what Congress has had a hard time with is balancing, right? Is this, when is a person being disloyal versus being, like a true whistleblower highlighting a problem, right? Is a policy a disagreement, a whistleblower type situation, or should that person just do their job or resign if they don't agree with the policy? But if the policy is legal, should they just do their job or leave, or do, right? Is a policy disagreement, something that somebody should blow the whistle on, right? So there's problems with that as well. All right, so now we're going to move on to, right, why, right, as we talk about, as I said at the beginning, why bureaucracies are so important, right? Because those in the administrative agencies and the bureaucracy, they're essentially policymakers, right? So we have this, in Congress passes this enabling legislation. They authorize, they create an administrative agency, they authorize it with a specific purpose, they give it powers to carry out a specific function, right? And Congress doesn't have the expertise or the specifics to provide the agency, so they give, oftentimes, these agencies a lot of particular power. They created the Federal Trade Commission, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 created the EEOC, right? You have OSHA, And like I said, these laws are created in vague terms. And when they're created in vague terms, it gives these agencies a lot of power to try to decipher and implement their own values within an agency about how to interpret the legislation, right? So they have to carry out those wishes, but they insert their own values to be able to do that. And so they become unelected policymakers. So if you look at about the environment in which they're making policy, right, they're impacting individuals, they're impacting companies, they're impacting interest groups. So because this is a very important responsibility, you know, the different changes, the rulemaking, it must be posted to the Federal Register. Typically a 60-day waiting period. Businesses, individuals, and whoever might have an interest have a right to respond. They can petition Congress to overturn the regulation. And after the waiting period, regulation often is challenged in court, right? So it's not the end of it. So they're essentially acting as policymakers, and then they have to deal with the repercussions of that when they implement that policy. What's the fallout? So these bureaucracies not only have a job to do, right, they have specific tasks to perform, but they can also be tied up in litigation as well when different groups, individuals challenge these regulations. So it can create a lot of controversies. So a lot of agencies, to cut back, to kind of streamline this process, have engaged in negotiated rulemaking. So they attempt to attempting to regulate through litigations gets very expensive. So what they do is they try to have this kind of participatory process, and they seek input from businesses and interest groups prior to implementing the regulations. And their goal is to kind of bargain their way through and try to understand, okay, how can I give a little bit to each side to kind of make each side happy, to cut down on the litigation, but still accomplish our task. So in 1990, the Negotiated Rulemaking Act sets out these rules for being able to negotiate in that way, right? So in there, we talk about negotiated rulemaking. We look at this concept of the iron triangle, right? So not only are interest groups concerned and companies concerned about what these agencies are doing, but they have a dependent relationship among each other and with Congress, right? So you have Congress, you have bureaucrats, you have interest groups form what we call this iron triangle, these relationships can be, very powerful. They can negatively impact the mission of these agencies and the effectiveness of the public policy, because Congress gets information from the interest groups. They get information from the bureaucracies. The bureaucracies work with the outside agencies and interest groups. They get expertise from them as well. But these agencies are also dependent on Congress for their budgets. These outside interest groups are dependent on both Congress and the regulatory agency for positive regulation from their perspective. So, right, these relationships can be a hindrance as well. And then so you have, right, going beyond that, these issue networks, right, depending on the issue, right, you have legislators and staff, bureaucrats, the media, right, they can work in this way through this network to work on a particular issue as well. So the administration, these agencies become very important in this process in the iron triangle and in these issue networks, right? So ways Congress controls the bureaucracy, and I didn't realize how late it was. We're gonna wrap up here in just a minute. So ways Congress can control the bureaucracy, right? We talked about enabling legislation, give them flexibility, but if they're not acting appropriate, they can also scale that back. They can cut their budgets. They can have investigations and hearings and engage in oversight to ask questions about what the agency is doing. So executive oversight also comes in right through the Office of Management and Budget. The legislative oversight comes from the Government Accountability Office as well. And then you have citizen oversight, but from a legislative component, we talked about the sunshine laws. So there's two basic ways to provide oversight through Congress, and it's the police patrol and the fire alarm. Congress tends to rely on the fire alarm approach. And that's like when there's a problem, someone pulls a fire alarm and then you take a look at what's going on and you send the help there to fix the problem, versus police patrol, where you're kind of just, you're in a police, cruiser, and you're patrolling the streets, looking for problems, all sorts of things constantly, right? Congress isn't doing that. Congress is more focused on the fire alarm approach. All right, so I'm going to stop my share. Okay. All right. So I went a little bit longer than I expected, but at least I'll get you out of here about 17, 18 minutes early. Any questions on any of that material?
Nope. Bye, guys.
All right. So get your apply your knowledge assignment in. And I'll send out reminders, but you have an exam, your final exam on Monday. But I'm going to stop recording. I'll